We are live.
We still don't have Director Chambers, but everybody else is here, it looks like.
Mhm.
So,
You're correct.
do you want to go ahead and get started?
I see a James Chambers in the attendees. Is that you possibly get the attendee link?
Yeah, he's on the attendee link.
You could have
Okay, we're
gone in
good.
that way.
Okay, let's get going. So welcome everyone. I'm going to call this meeting to order. It's officially 6:02. So welcome everyone to the Mound Basin GSA online public workshop number 2. And Jackie, could you please call the roll?
Yes, Chair. Commencing roll call. May I have Director Rundgren, please?
Yes.
Director Shepherd,
Here.
Director Everts,
Here.
Director Chambers,
Here.
and Chair Mobley.
Here.
All 5 directors are present.
All right. I'd like to ask for public comments. Anyone from the public can comment on anything that's not on the agenda. Raise your hand so you can be recognized.
At this
Raising
time, I
your-
don't see any
Yeah.
hands raised. No questions, nothing in the chat.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Bondi then. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Chair Mobley. Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Bondi. I'm the Executive Director of the Mound Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and I want to thank you for joining us for our GSP workshop number 2. We're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping here. Want to make sure everybody is familiar with the webinar features. In your panels, you should have options shown on the screen here to mute yourself, and we ask that everybody stay muted unless you're speaking to minimize feedback. There's a chat function. You can exchange information with panelists or other attendees through that tool. And then there are 2 ways to ask questions. You can either raise your hand, and then we will ask you to unmute, and you can verbalize your question. Or if you feel more comfortable or would rather just type it, you can go ahead and use the Q&A function to type your question. We will have staff monitoring the Q&A tool during the presentations, and where possible, we will answer questions as we go through that tool. Otherwise, there'll be time at the end of each session to ask questions. I want to briefly review the agenda for the workshop. So tonight we have 3 main topics that we want to cover. We want to introduce something called sustainable management criteria. We want to talk about groundwater modeling and the water budgets that have been developed from the groundwater model. And then we want to come back and talk more specifically about proposed sustainable management criteria for the groundwater sustainability plan. So those will be our three sessions. We'll have a break in between the second and third session. And we're going to kick off the meeting with a few poll questions to get to know who's attending as stakeholders. And then we'll close with a general Q&A feature or session where you can speak and provide feedback or ask questions. And we'll have a few more polls about the topics that were presented. And then lastly, we'll have a period of time and opportunity for the GSA directors to make comments. So with that, why don't we go ahead and roll into our first set of poll questions. Zach, if you could run those for us, please. So you should be seeing a screen pop up that has 3 questions in it. If you could go ahead and read the question and pick the best answer that fits your circumstances, we'd appreciate that. And we'll give you a minute here to do that, and then we'll review the results. We've got about half of the attendees have participated so far. We'll give it another minute. A few more seconds here in case somebody's just wrapping up. All right, Zach, you want to close the poll and show the results, please? Okay, great. So everybody should be able to see the poll results. The first question was just trying to understand which of our outreach methods is working the best for advertising these workshops. Looks like email, email and word of mouth is pretty much how people are finding out about the meetings. So that's good information for us. Second question is trying to understand what stakeholder interests you represent. Looks like pretty much everybody either is here from the general public or is an employee or of another public agency that isn't part of the GSA. And then lastly, we're trying to understand your familiarity with Sigma, and looks like at least everybody has some familiarity with Sigma, and most of the people are very familiar. So good information. So thank you for answering those questions. I think we can shut that one down, Zach. All right. So let's go ahead and move into our first presentation session. So each one of these presentation sessions, we will present a series of slides and then try and leave time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And then again, we have a general question and answer period reserved towards the end of the meeting. So if we don't get to your questions after a particular presentation, rest assured we'll have time towards the end. So this session is intended to introduce everybody to the sustainable management criteria, which is a very important part of the GSP. But first, I want to take a step back and remind everybody the big picture requirements for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. There's really 3 very high level requirements under Sigma. The first is to form a groundwater sustainability agency for the basin. That was accomplished a number of years ago. That's the Mound Basin GSA. The second requirement is to adopt a groundwater sustainability plan, and that is what the GSA is currently working on, and that document is due to be adopted and submitted to the State Department of Water Resources no later than January 31st, 2022. So that is our current focus. And then following adoption of the GSP, the third requirement is to implement that GSP to attain or achieve or maintain sustainable groundwater management in the basin. And Sigma requires that the GSA achieve sustainable management if the basin isn't already sustainable within 20 years of adopting the GSP. So that's the big picture of what Sigma is all about and what our requirements are. So what is the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP? I like to think of it as a roadmap, a flexible roadmap for how the GSA and the stakeholders in the basin will achieve or maintain sustainable conditions for groundwater over the long term. And Sigma requires that we achieve sustainability and define sustainability in the context of avoiding what are called undesirable results. And we're going to do that through a data-driven and adaptive management framework over the 20 years and beyond. So what must be included in a GSP? There are a number of requirements that are laid out in the regulations for the contents of GSPs. We have to have administrative information about the agency, who the agency is comprised of, et cetera. We have to describe the basin conditions. So what is the geology, the hydrogeology, and the groundwater conditions of the basin? And this sets the framework for developing the third component of the plan, which is the sustainable management criteria, which we're going to be focusing much of our discussion on tonight. The requirements for the GSP also include a monitoring network, and this is important because monitoring is used to demonstrate sustainability. And then the plan may include projects and management actions if the GSA determines that projects or management actions are necessary to achieve or maintain sustainability. And then lastly, we have to have a section describing implementation. We have to have a budget and explain what we're going to do, approximately when, in terms of implementing our plan. So now focusing on the sustainable management criteria, really the key concept for the sustainable management criteria in Sigma in general is this concept of avoiding undesirable results. And we'll unpack what that term means in a later slide. And we're trying to avoid undesirable results for 6 different indicators, sustainability indicators that Sigma has identified. And they're shown in the graphic on the slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about each one as we go through the presentations this evening. It's important to understand that the undesirable results and the actions that will be necessary to prevent those undesirable results are defined at the local level by the GSA, not the state. So it's up to this agency and this board to decide what's undesirable and what we need to do to prevent those undesirable conditions. And of course, your input as stakeholders is critical in making those decisions. So within the sustainable management criteria section of the GSP, we have to identify 4 different aspects that collectively comprise the sustainable management criteria. The first is a sustainability goal, which covers the entire plan. And then for each sustainability indicator, we have to identify and describe the undesirable results, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And I'll explain later what the quantitative criteria are. Also, for each sustainability indicator, we have to identify something called a minimum threshold. And this is a quantitative metric, something we can measure in the field, like a groundwater level or a concentration of some constituent in water that we can measure quantitatively that is used to determine whether we have significant and unreasonable effects at a particular location or area represented by a particular monitoring location. This indicates that there may be significant unreasonable effects for a particular indicator or indicators happening in that area. Also, at each location we're monitoring or have identified as representative for an area, we need to identify something called a measurable objective. Again, this is another quantitative metric, something we can measure in the field, that is going to indicate what our desired basin conditions are for that region. So breaking down each of those four major components a little bit more. Before I do that, I want to let you know that this board takes the sustainable management criteria seriously, and actually has developed a very deliberate process because the sustainable management criteria are so key to the GSP. So we've developed a very deliberate process, and this flow chart walks you through what that process is for defining the sustainable management criteria for the GSP. I'm not going to go through the flow chart in detail. For those who are interested, it's available on the website, and you could view it there or download it and study it. But the point here is that we have a process that we're following to develop the criteria. So unpacking those into four individual components of the SMCs, the first one I mentioned was the sustainability goal. This is sort of an umbrella over all of the sustainable management indicators. And for the plan itself, it's a high-level policy framework. The idea here is to provide that framework to guide the development of the sustainable management criteria and guide the development of plan actions that would be necessary to be sustainable. This has already been something that the board has worked through and sought stakeholder feedback on, and it was adopted last September. So those of you that are interested in reviewing this, it is available online, and you can download it there, or actually just you can read it off of the slide as well. So now getting back to the undesirable results. Again, this is the key part of this SMCs and the GSP in general. I want to take a minute to break down the definition of undesirable results and make sure that everybody understands what the regulatory language is. Because in a lot of conversations I have with folks, there's a lot of confusion about this term. And in some cases, people think it's, defined based on how they feel or what just their ideas. But actually the regulations have a very specific definition, and I think the folks that wrote this were very deliberate in it. So there's three components to having undesirable results in a basin. The first is you have to have significant and unreasonable effects. So these would be, an example would be seawater intrusion that renders an area of groundwater unusable for a current or future beneficial use. That would be something that most people would probably agree is a significant and unreasonable effect. The second component is that significant and unreasonable effect to be an undesirable result under SGMA has to have been caused by groundwater conditions. And that means basically that either it was caused by pumping of the groundwater resource, or it was caused by implementation of a GSP project or management action. So SGMA does not require GSAs to address things that might be significant and unreasonable, but that weren't caused by pumping or weren't caused by plan implementation. The third element of the definition is throughout the basin. And what this is getting at is that the significant and unreasonable effects either need to be occurring over a large portion of the basin or caused by groundwater conditions that exist in a large portion of the basin. So an example of something that might be significant and unreasonable and caused by groundwater conditions would be localized pumping drawdown, with pumping affecting a number of wells in a particular area. But that's not something that's caused, it's not caused by plan implementation, and it's not occurring over a large portion of the basin. So that probably wouldn't be considered an undesirable result. I hope that example makes sense. So moving on, this flow chart is intended to kind of put all those concepts together, this is the flow chart that would be followed to determine if undesirable results are occurring in the basin for one of the sustainability indicators. We don't have time to go through step by step through the flow chart, but I do want to highlight the two key elements which are in the blue area on the right. And that is, again, that the minimum thresholds indicate significant and unreasonable effects may be occurring in a particular area of the basin, but that we don't have undesirable results unless we have a combination of those minimum thresholds being exceeded across the basin as we define in our plan. Hopefully that makes sense. This diagram is intended to depict a particular monitoring location where we've identified a minimum threshold and a measurable objective. And so in this example, you might be looking at the green line for minimum threshold being a groundwater level that you don't want to go below because you believe there would be significant unreasonable effects for one of the indicators. So you can see that if groundwater levels are below the green line, the graphic indicates that there's significant and unreasonable conditions. If you're above the line, you're somewhere above the line, but in between the line and the measurable objective, you're along your path to achieving sustainability. And that's indicated with the 3 IMs. Those stand for interim milestones, which our plan will have to identify at 5-year increments to show what our path towards achieving our measurable objective is. So this concept would apply at all of the different monitoring locations we identify in the plan to represent the conditions in the basin. So what is the status of our development of sustainable management criteria? Well, so far to date, we have screened out one of the 6 indicators that we do not believe is applicable, and that's the surface water depletion indicator. And it's actually interconnected surface water depletion is the full terminology used in SGMA. And what that means is an area where the surface water body, in this case, we would be looking at the Santa Clara River or the estuary, being interconnected with the water table of one of our principal aquifers in the basin. And in our case, in our basin, the principal aquifers, as shown in this diagram, the Magoo and the Wainimi are located hundreds of feet below ground surface and are separated from the Santa Clara River and the estuary by a very thick zone of fine-grained sedimentary deposits, which effectively isolate the Magoo aquifer from the surface water system. So we have concluded in our basin setting that there's not a material connection between the principal aquifers and pumping within those principal aquifers and the surface water bodies. Therefore, we are able to screen out the sustainability indicator. The remaining indicators we'll touch upon in the third presentation. We want to go ahead and present the groundwater model information first because we're using some of the results from the groundwater model to help develop the sustainable management criteria for these other indicators. So we'll save that for the third presentation after John has gone through the modeling. So with that, that concludes the presentation for the first session, and we have time for questions and comments. We'll go ahead and open it up. I have not been tracking the chat or the Q&A, so Jackie or John, I don't know, is there anything in there?
There's nothing right now, Brian. No hands raised, no chatting, no Q&A at this moment.
Okay, well, we'll give people a moment for that to sink in. I see a few more people have joined since the presentation started. That's great. Okay, well, if you think of a question or a comment, we again will have a general comment and question session towards the end. So you can either put it in the chat if something pops into your mind, or you can save it for later. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the next session on groundwater modeling and water budgets. And I will start with just a few slides, and then I want to hand it over to John Lindquist from United Water Conservation District, who's been working very hard with the rest of the United team on modeling the groundwater basin and evaluating those model results. So let me just start with a few slides. I wanted to go over the requirements for modeling to provide some context for what we're doing. And also because the way our scope is laid out with United, the GSA needed to provide the assumptions for the modeling runs that we did. So this was work that I did with our consultant Intera, who we have Abhishek Singh is online with us in the audience, who worked on this as well. So the requirements under Sigma for modeling future conditions in the basin have several components. The first component is it requires a 50-year projection of groundwater conditions, including a water budget for the basin. And John will explain what a water budget is. And we must use 50 years or more of historical hydrology. So we don't make up the rainfall conditions. We have to go back in time and use some period of actual measured conditions that we then assume would be representative of potential future conditions. So that's how that works. And in terms of water demand for pumping on the basin and other water that's used in the basin, we have to rely on, or we're required to rely on recent conditions. So we look at, in our case of this basin, the city is the water supplier, and there's agricultural uses. So we focused on the city's existing documents for current conditions, and as well as their planning documents for future water demands. Sigma requires us to evaluate 3 potential effects on water demand. The potential effect of land use change, population change, and climate change. So we analyzed those, and I'll break those down here on the next few slides. So after we developed our recommendations, we brought them to the board last September for discussion and got input, and then we moved forward with the modeling. And what we discussed with the board was to use a 77-year period, so more than the 50 years of historical conditions to use as a proxy for our future. And the reason we used more than 50 years is because United is also modeling with the same model for the Fillmore and Piru basins. And we felt it was simpler to model a longer period and then let each GSA pick which 50 years within that longer period it wanted to use in its GSP. So tonight I'm gonna be showing later some graphs that show all 77 years. I just don't want there to be confusion about why we're using 77 instead of the 50 in the Sigma requirements. In terms of groundwater pumping, I outreached to the Mound Basin Agricultural Water Group and put together some information about historical pumping and worked with them to develop what their best estimates of future agricultural water pumping would be, and took those numbers, and we've spread them out differently a little bit in wet years versus dry years to try and capture the differing demands based on differing rainfall conditions. And so the assumed future pumping ranges from about 2,900 acre feet to just over 3,500 in dry years. And so that's input into the model using the wells that are currently pumping in the recent history. We worked with the city of Ventura to understand what their future planning is, and they told us that they plan to pump 4,000 acre feet per year. And they have some new wells planned. And so we were able to allocate that pumping according to the facilities that they plan on using going forward. And then we have 2 relatively small industrial wells in the basin, and we simply assumed that they'll continue pumping at their recent historical amounts. The Mound Basin does adjoin to the Santa Paula Basin and the Oxnard Basin, and there is a degree of hydraulic communication between the Mound Basin and those basins. So we had to make assumptions about what the future conditions would be in those basins. So for the Santa Paula Basin, which is managed under a court adjudication, we simply assumed that future pumping would be consistent with recent pumping because they're already under a management program with the court. For the Oxnard Basin, they're going through SGMA, just like us. They're a couple years ahead of us because they're a higher priority basin that had to complete their GSP sooner. So they've already done their analysis, and we reached out to them and asked them what the best set of assumptions for the future are. And they told us basically which one of their scenarios to replicate in the Oxnard Basin portion of the groundwater model. Going through that process, we had to make a few adjustments, some small adjustments on some issues that we discovered in the Oxnard Basin, and that was done as part of this effort. Another assumption we had to make was what the artificial recharge operations were going to be that United performs in the forebay portion of the Oxnard Plain. There is some planning for an expansion of those operations, and so our analysis considered that expansion as well. Now, getting back to the SGMA requirements, for the 3 criteria we have to evaluate for water demand. The first is land use impact on water demand. And we took a look at the current conditions in the region and concluded that because we have something called a SOAR initiative, a Save Open Space and Agricultural Resources initiative, that requires voter approval for areas that are subject to that initiative, primarily open space and agricultural land, requires voter approval to go into development, and that those initiatives are approved through 2050. We felt it was reasonable to assume that there would not be a significant amount of conversion of ag land or open space to other types of land use that could impact water demand. We also noted that the city, which overlies the city of Ventura, which overlies the vast majority of the basin, has a net zero policy for water on new development. So that's a further reason why, even if there was some land use change that occurred, a further reason why we would not expect a material change in water demand that would impact this plan. The second criteria we have to consider is population change. And for the same reasons that I cite for land use, we concluded that population change would not have a significant enough change impact on water demands that would affect our plan. So we've assumed that there is no impact there that we need to consider in our planning. The third criteria that we have to consider is climate change. And so for climate change, DWR provides factors called change factors that the GSAs can use to apply to their hydrologic data that allow us to simulate what projected climate change might be in the 2030 timeframe and the 2070 timeframe. And that also includes sea level rise in those factors that we apply to our model, because we do run up against the Pacific Ocean on the western edge of the basin. So we ran several scenarios to consider climate change. So here's a map just showing the land use and the SOAR boundary. I'm not going to get into the details here, but the takeaway is that anywhere that has cross hatching that's yellow is ag land under SOAR, and any other color with cross hatching is going to be your open space that's under SOAR. So what you can see here is basically all of the land that could potentially be developed in the basin is subject to SOAR. And hopefully that helps visually show why we concluded that there wouldn't be a material impact on water demand due to land use change going forward. And again, if any of these assumptions prove to be wrong, SGMA requires that the GSA update its plans every 5 years. So our crystal ball just needs to be good enough to get started. So after considering all these factors, we laid out 4 different model scenarios that were run through United's model. And the first is, well, actually there's a 5th one, which is just our historical model, the calibrated model, which covered the period 85 through 2019. And we rely on that information for our historical water budget. But in terms of our future scenarios, we ran 4. We ran a baseline that basically uses all the assumptions above. And then we ran 3 additional ones to evaluate the different climate change conditions, the 2030 conditions and the 2070 conditions. So the only changes in those runs were that we changed our hydrologic inputs using those DWR factors for 2030 and 2070. And then we ran a 4th scenario using the 2070 climate change conditions, but we removed the Freeman Diversion Expansion Project. And you can kind of think of this as the worst case simulation. We wanted to see the effect of how much the Freeman Diversion Expansion affected groundwater conditions in our basin. Lastly, we also did something called particle tracking, which is an add-on to the groundwater model that allows us to look at how water moves and the rates of water movement in the basin. I'll talk more about this in the 3rd presentation and how we use that to evaluate seawater intrusion risk. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to John.
Excuse me, Brian. We do have one question. I don't know if you want to address that now or wait till your Q&A.
Why don't we let John get going, and
Okay.
I'll take a look at that question and see if I can answer it.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you, Jay.
And thank you, Brian, for the introduction. So I'll just dive right in. I've got a lot of material to cover in a relatively short amount of time, but Brian did a great job of introducing the topic, so it should go well. And I think it will be interesting. I'm not going to dive into all the model results that Brian talked about that we did, because frankly, even though I'm excited by that subject, going through every model run would be boring even to me. So, but I will touch on the highlights. So this is the outline of my presentation, hopefully be done in about 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to cover just a quick recap of our groundwater flow model, what it involves, and how it was applied to the to this challenge to figure out our future water budgets. And I'll mention that the model was discussed pretty extensively by one of my colleagues, Dr. Jason Sun, at a previous workshop for Mound Basin. I think it was September, Brian. So there, his presentation is there if you'd like to see more details of the groundwater flow model. And then I'll go into a quick review of groundwater conditions in Mound Basin that affect water budgets. Some of this material that I'll talk about under outline number 2 is stuff we also talked about at the previous workshop back in September. But I do want to touch on some basics so that we're all at the same starting point for the conversation tonight. Then I'll talk about historical and current water budgets, and finally projected water budgets. So just a couple slides quickly about the model. This is United's model area. It includes the Mound Basin, but as you can see, let's see if I can get my animations to go. There we go. It includes the other basins that are in United's service area that are all interconnected in Ventura County. And there's not always a great degree of groundwater underflow from basin to basin, but there is in between some flow anyways, but groundwater underflow in the aquifers below the basins in between each and every basin in our service area and in the model area. So just a quick description of also the vertical layering of the model. It's not just covering a large area, it's also covering a significant depth. And there are 13 hydrostratigraphic units underlying not just Mound Basin, but the other basins. There are 7 aquifers. Not all those aquifers exist in Mound Basin, but throughout the model area, there are a total of 7 aquifers and 6 aquitards. In Mound Basin, we just have to worry about a few aquifers or think about a few aquifers. The shallow alluvial aquifer, that's not a principal aquifer. There's just a shallow zone with some groundwater that's not used. Then there's the gray area there shows a, we call it an aquitard, a fine grained deposits, can't really extract any water from, between that shallow alluvial aquifer and the underlying Magoo aquifer, then another aquitard, then the Wainimi aquifer, which does get significant pumping, as does the Magoo aquifer. Then another slim or slender aquitard before we reach the Fox Canyon aquifer that is used quite a bit in Oxnard Plain, but it's hardly used at all in the Mound Basin, partly because it's so deep. And there are a couple of aquifers, like I said, that exist elsewhere, like the Oxnard aquifer over in Oxnard Basin, but it's not in Mound Basin, and the Grimes Canyon aquifer at depth in Oxnard Basin and Las Postas Valley and Pleasant Valley Basin. And the model is calibrated, and I just wanted to touch on the calibration process. Calibration is really a way to ensure that the model can match reality. And this, this map shows Mound Basin and some of the wells we use for calibrating the model, and the graph in the upper left. The blue dots on that graph show actual groundwater elevation measurements at a well there that we've taken over the years. And then the orange line shows how the model predicted or represented in the past groundwater elevations at that well. And you can see the model matches elevations at that well pretty darn well. And then we did this for a number of wells. This isn't all of the wells in Mound Basin that we calibrated to, or in Oxnard Plain adjacent to Mound Basin. This is just a little sample. There were actually hundreds of wells that we calibrated the model to throughout the model domain, including dozens in Mound Basin. So you look at the plots real quickly, you'll see, yeah, the model does generally do a good job of simulating or projecting actual water levels in the basin, which is one of the keys to the sustainability criteria that Brian will be talking about later. So that's it for just my quick review of the model. I also want to, I'm going to turn off my video because I think it's slowing down my animations here. I want to talk about water budgets. And I want to start with some definitions and acronyms that you'll be hearing throughout my presentation and maybe a little bit later as well. And let's see if I can get these to go. Sorry, hang on a second. Okay, good, here we go. So water budget that I'm talking about, it's just an accounting of how much water flows into or out of a groundwater basin. And it includes recharge and discharge, like pumping from wells. It includes underflow to and from adjacent basins in the aquifers under the surface of the land. And it includes change in storage, which is really changes in groundwater elevation. So as groundwater elevations rise, you have more water in storage in the basin. And as groundwater levels fall, that means you're having a decline in storage. And I personally prefer water balance as a more accurate term. DWR uses the term water budget, so that's what you'll see in the report, and that's what you'll see in the rest of my presentation. But it's more like you're balancing your checkbook to find out how much money you have in it. Nobody's putting anybody on a budget at this point. We're not budgeting money, we're not budgeting water at this point. So again, my preferred term is water balance. DWR requires that we talk about it in terms of water budget. And some abbreviations I'll be using. This is an easy one. I'll say ag, and you'll see it on some of my maps and graphs, and that just means agriculture. M&I is municipal and industrial. Those are basically like city wells or water use for municipal and industrial purposes. And then this is a big one that you'll see throughout the report, and you'll also see throughout our presentation. We talk about water balance or budgets in terms of acre feet per year. And an acre feet or acre foot is an awful unit. It's neither metric nor standard English, but it is used commonly in water resources studies, especially in agricultural areas. And it's basically the volume of water that would cover 1 acre to a depth of 1 foot. And that's about 326,000 gallons. But you can imagine farmers like to think about how much water they need. They need to add a couple of feet of irrigation water to each acre of land. So they talk a lot about acre feet. It kind of makes sense, even though modern scientists like myself prefer the metric system. And I just wanted next to give a brief review of the inflows and outflows to Mound Basin conceptually, not talking numbers yet, just where does the water come from in general and where does it go to? So you can see Mound Basin here. This is a satellite image. Mound Basin is outlined in green, and then you can see the adjacent basins to Mound in the Pacific Ocean off to the west. And here are some pretty notable landmarks that anybody from Mound Basin probably knows about. Most of Mound Basin is urban and suburban developed land, or M&I land. About 9,000 acres out of the total of 14,000 acres in Mound Basin is cityscape, let's call it. We have about 2,500 acres of agricultural land in the three, green parcels. You can tell those are farms from the satellite image. It's kind of neat. And then there's another about 2,500 acres of mostly undeveloped land in the northern foothills. There are a few orchards up there also, and some homes in parts of it, but that area is largely undeveloped. And we have underflow, as Brian mentioned, from Santa Paula Basin entering Mound Basin. We also have underflow coming into Mound Basin from Oxnard, especially out to the east towards the forebay, but it also exits Mound Basin a little farther west. So there's both inflow and outflow across the Oxnard Basin boundary. And then the interesting one is the coastline. So I've got these arrows here. There's water flowing west out of Mound Basin across the coastline, and it also flows back east into Mound Basin from the coastline. But I'm going to touch on this. This is a very important point. That's not necessarily groundwater exchanging with seawater. And then at the boundary with Lower Ventura River Basin, that's a groundwater divide. There's not really much inflow or outflow across Mound Basin or exchange water with Lower Ventura River Basin. And then there are a bunch of wells that comprise much of the discharge from the basin. So this shows the approximate locations of all the active pumping wells as of 2019. You can see they're mostly south of the 126 or the 101 freeway. And they supply agricultural lands and the M&I land, like Brian talked about a minute ago. And then there's another component that isn't really directly related to groundwater, at least at first. This is imported water. There's quite a bit of water imported from Ventura River Basin, but it gets applied on the land, and some of that, not much of it, but some of it leaks downward into the aquifers and recharges the aquifers. So that's how these imported sources of water are important, and they have to be discussed in the GSP as required by Department of Water Resources, DWR. There's also quite a bit of water imported from Oxnard Basin. So you can see my little bright blue arrow headed south or down into Oxnard Basin. Well, much of that water just gets pumped from wells just south of here back into Mound Basin. So it's not really a net loss. Yeah, there's a couple of wells there. And finally, there's a fair amount of water pumped in from Santa Paula Basin, groundwater that gets imported for both ag and M&I use. And I wanted to touch on, this is really important, that whole seawater and that coastal exchange. I drew these arrows on that first map, and it implies that, hey, there's water exchanging with the ocean. But the aquifers are actually 7-10 miles offshore, the Magoo Aquifer and the Wainimi Aquifer. So these little arrows, we have to draw these arrows showing, hey, there's an exchange across the Mound Basin boundaries with the across the coastline. I don't want, and Brian doesn't want people to think that there's seawater, either groundwater directly discharging to seawater or seawater coming into the basin at that point. Realistically, that exchange happens over a long distance, and it takes quite a while. And over the last 70 years, nobody's seen any evidence of groundwater or seawater intrusion in Mound Basin. So yeah, don't get too excited about coastal exchange of water. It's not necessarily all that meaningful. These aquifers, they extend all the way offshore underneath the seafloor by a couple of 100 feet, and there's actually quite a bit of fresh water stored there. So the methods we use to calculate the water budget, it relied largely on United's groundwater model, which is why we spent a few minutes talking about it. And we know some things that we input to the model. These on the far left column over here, we know groundwater pumping, and we know the imports, and we know rainfall. So these aren't things that the model calculates. This is stuff that we tell the model and that we know are happening. And we use some of that information to do old-fashioned calculations with calculators and whatnot. The recharge rates, including mountain front recharge and infiltration of rainfall and return flows. I'll talk about what those are in a minute. And how much surface water is flowing down in the Santa Clara River watershed. But what the model really does best, and it's something that we can't do very well with calculators or for the old timer slide rules, we have, the model can do a much better job of telling us what the groundwater underflows are to and from adjacent basins and what sort of surface water and groundwater interaction exists or occurs. It also does a good job of telling us about evaporation from shallow groundwater, or transpiration also. Change in storage, which is key. And then there's a little bit of discharge to tile drains. The model also tells us, probably not important, but it's one of the model inputs for completeness. So probably the best way to introduce folks to the water budget is to talk about what it's been for the last 35 years and give you an idea of what's happened. This is a little block diagram that I drew by hand myself. Very proud of it. And shows some farms and some houses. And it also, so this is kind of a map view on the top. And then on the sides, this is a cross-sectional view as if you were cutting into the earth, you know, slicing into it vertically to give you an idea of what's going on underneath. And there's a shallow alluvial aquifer that we talked about a few minutes ago. You can barely see it. It's very thin and it's right at land surface. And then there's some aquitard. And then we have the Magoo aquifer, the Hueneme aquifer, and the Fox Canyon aquifer at great depth. This isn't water budget info yet. This is just easy conceptual hydrogeology here. Now here comes the water budget. We get underflow from Santa Paula Basin. We talked about that. And the model tells us that the average over the last 35 years was about 4,500 acre feet per year of inflow. So that's the biggest component of inflow to the water budget for Mound Basin. And aerial recharge comes in a close second at 3,700 acre feet per year. Although to be realistic, that most of this water, its interaction all occurs in the shallow groundwater system. And not all of that water gets down to the Magoo or Hueneme or Fox Canyon aquifers. Everything that falls in the middle part of the basin, most of the interactions are pretty shallow and they don't affect the principal aquifers, which are Magoo and Hueneme. Mountain front recharge is important to those aquifers though, the Magoo, Hueneme, and Fox. That's the water that falls in the foothills north of Mound Basin in those less permeable soils and whatnot in the foothills. It flows down, and when this water, you know, flows through the streams and reaches the boundaries of Mound Basin, where suddenly it finds permeable aquifers exposed at land surface, a lot of that water infiltrates into those aquifers. So that's an important source of recharge. Now, discharge. The biggest by far, the elephant in the room, is 7,300 acre feet per year of pumping on average over the last 35 years. That's actually declined recently, but the long-term average is about 7,300 acre feet. We have coastal flux, the little arrows I showed you coming in and out of the ocean. The net impact and the average over the last 35 years has been 1,100 acre feet per year of outflow from the basin beyond the coastline, and presumably eventually reaching those outcrops 7 to 10 miles offshore. We also have ET as a discharge. This is the direct evapotranspiration from plants and surface water in the lower Santa Clara River. It's not all evaporation that occurs, you know, like after a rainstorm or anything like that. That's handled a different way. This is just the ET that occurs from shallow groundwater present, like I said, along the Santa Clara River for that last mile or so that it flows through Mound Basin. And finally, the net impact of underflow with Oxnard Basin, some comes in, I said some goes out. In the past 35 years, the average has been 1,400 acre feet per year out of Mound Basin into Oxnard Basin. Remember what I said, some of that gets just pumped from wells just outside of Mound Basin and it gets distributed back into the basin. So it's really not a net loss. And then the tile drains, minor, those are just shallow drains that are suspected to occur under some farmland near the Santa Clara River to prevent roots from getting waterlogged. And they take a little bit of that shallow water, maybe some perched water. It's not very much. It's a very minor component of the water budget. And they take it out of the system and I think they put it in the river ultimately. Oh, then we have a little stream channel recharge in the Santa Clara River. It goes both ways. The Santa Clara River can receive groundwater from adjacent shallow perched aquifers or the alluvial aquifer, but it could also, some of that water infiltrates down through the bottom of the channel and recharges the aquifer. So the net over the last 35 years, according to the model, has been about 20 acre feet per year of recharge in the Santa Clara River. So you can add up outflow, 11,100 acre feet per year. You can subtract the inflows, and what you get is about a 400 acre feet per year net deficit over the last 35 years. So that's a decline in storage, which means groundwater levels decline. And that's about 0.12 feet per year. It's really not very much in the grand scheme of things. Nope, this graph didn't come in exactly the way I wanted. Here, this is a little better. The black line is the cumulative change in stored groundwater that we calculated over time. And you see we start out at 0, but we end up at a net deficit. This is about 400 acre feet per year over the 35 years. The green dots and lines are groundwater level measurements from one well in the basin, but all the wells do pretty much the same thing. This shows actual water levels. It correlates very well with change in storage, exactly like you'd expect. That's what I talked about earlier. A change in groundwater storage, if storage is increasing, it means you have rising water levels. If storage is declining, you have declining water levels. For the future budget, Brian already touched on this, so I'll just leave this slide here and move on. It's in the presentation if you want to review it, but Brian hit all these points. So this is the baseline future looking forward 2022 through 2096, I believe. And this right now is showing the old water budget, the historic water budget, but you'll see what happens to that number. I'm going to change it there to 3,700 acre feet. So it was 45 under the old historical water budget. Under the new future conditions, we're actually looking at a little less water flowing into the basin from Santa Paula Basin. Aerial recharge changes, it goes down a little to 3,100 acre feet. So this is starting to look a little troubling, right? We're seeing less water entering the basin. Pumping increases a little bit due to just slightly different climate over the long run. Coastal flux, that increases greatly. So we're seeing more outflows and less inflows so far. And we might be getting nervous. ET actually declines a little bit. Underflow to Oxnard Basin, remember it was formerly out of the basin and into Oxnard Basin. This is one of the big changes. Now it's going to be reversed according to the model in the future. So we actually have 3,100 acre feet of groundwater flowing into the basin now in the future, looking at the next 76 years or whatever it was, Brian, 77. And tile drains, they decline a little, again, a minor point. And stream channel recharge. Actually, we end up with a lot more stream channel recharge. So that's fairly significant in the future model. And so this is the old outflow minus inflow balance down there in that yellow box in the lower left. Now we're seeing outflows go up, but inflows also rise. And so the net effect is instead of a 400 acre feet per year increase or decrease in storage, now we're going to have an increase in storage. And I'm sorry that number is a -100. That's a little bit confusing, but this is actually good news. This means that water levels will be pretty stable in the foreseeable future. And in fact, they will rise slightly, although 100 acre feet is very minor. And storage, this is the important thing. Remember, this is going to reflect changes in groundwater elevation over time in Mound Basin. The old graph showed it going up and down. The new graph looking forward from 2022 on the left to 2096 on the right shows a general increase. The blue and red boxes around the dates or years at the bottom, those show dry years in red and wet years in blue. You can see we have a decline at the end just because we're assuming a drought at the end. Again, nobody is forecasting that the climate for 2022 through 2096 is going to be identical to 1943 to 2019. This is just some assumptions we plug in so that we can see what happens in the basin if we have a similar climate cycle that we've seen in the past. You could plug in any kind of numbers you want, but this seems like a reasonable approach. So we also applied the 2030 and 2070 climate change factors to a couple model runs, also to see how that affected the budget. And as Brian mentioned, included sea level rise. And I'm going to just dive right in. I do want to mention that a lot of folks think about climate change. Some folks think, hey, it's going to get drier and hotter. Well, this is California DWR's fourth climate change assessment and done in 2018. And they're actually predicting, we're showing Mound Basin here, they're predicting in the South Coast a 1.1% increase in precipitation by mid-21st century and a 6.4% increase in precipitation in the Central Coast by the mid-century. And by late century, the graph on the right, 0 increase in precipitation, but also no decline in the South Coast, and still a 6.2% increase in the Central Coast. And Mound Basin is right on the cusp between these two. So if you do a little more closer look, you actually see that the predictions right now are for slightly increased rainfall in Mound Basin through the 21st century. So kind of good news compared to some parts of the world that are going to get, like we talked about, much drier, perhaps hotter. So the future budget climate, this time I'm going to compare the baseline water budget to now the 2070 climate change budget. And I skipped 2030 because we just don't have time, and 2070 is a more severe climate change. So this is the old inflow from Santa Paula at 3,700 acre feet. There's no change under the 2070 climate change factors. Aerial recharge goes from 3,100. It actually increases a little because we have more rainfall to 3,300. Mountain front recharge increases slightly. Good news. Pumping, it actually increases significantly, and that's because the forecast is for a little more evapotranspiration and higher temperatures. So the assumption is that we'll need to apply a little more water to crops. Even though we're getting more rainfall, we'll have to apply even more water to crops and to the cityscape to keep things working under the temperature rise we're seeing in the future, to keep the plants irrigated, to keep your landscape going, and so on. Coastal flux, it actually decreases a little. ET, a little change. Underflow from Oxnard Basin, again, a small amount of change. Tile drains, no change. Stream channel recharge, no change. Outflow and inflow from the basin, very small net change when you add it all up. Oops, sorry, I went too far. So the point is the 2070 climate cycles that DWR required us to simulate, they don't change the water budget very much from the baseline, which is great news. And then just to show change in storage for 2070, I'll show the baseline in a second, but if you remember the last graph I showed you of this type for projected change in storage for the baseline, it looked a lot like this. So this is 2070 climate change, and look carefully, you'll see there's very small differences in the overall storage, which means groundwater elevation in the basin, whether we have baseline conditions or 2070 climate change conditions. It's a very minor change. So that uncertainty is small. In the grand scheme of things, the actual climate cycle is consistent with history, whether it's Pacific Decadal Oscillation or El Nino Southern Oscillation. Those things probably are going to have a greater impact on water budgets in the basin for the foreseeable future, for the rest of this century, probably a bigger change than, or bigger impact than climate change. So I went a little long, sorry about that, Brian, but that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, we had a couple questions come through that I answered in the Q&A panel. One of them is about the modeling and basically wanting to understand United's releases from Lake Piru, and I replied that those are accounted for in the model, both past and future. United made assumptions about future releases as part of the future analysis. So hopefully that answers that question. Are there other questions at this time on the modeling? You can raise your hand or type a question. Okay, well, we are running a little bit behind, so I'll cut that off here. If you think of something, go ahead and type it in or save it for the general Q&A session at the end. And at this point, we had scheduled in a 5-minute break. Why don't we cut that down to 2 or 3 since we're running a little bit behind? And I show 7:04 on my computer. Oh, 7:05 now. Why don't we reconvene at 7:08?
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Get started here in a few seconds. Looks like we have some folks who are still away. We'll give it another minute here. It's like maybe 3 minutes wasn't enough. Said most of my directors are still gone. We'll give it another minute here. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. All right, so our third session is, the purpose of it is to communicate proposed sustainable management criteria for the basin. And why don't we dive right into that? So the first session laid out the requirements and described what the sustainable management criteria are. Now we're going to talk about what we're proposing for some of the different sustainability indicators. And I want to start with water quality because this is something that we proposed already with the board, has had some discussion, and we want to get stakeholder feedback on it, as well as the other indicators. But this was the first one that we tackled while we were developing the model, because this one doesn't depend on model results. So for the water quality SMC, or actually the full title is degraded water quality SMC, the first thing we did is evaluated our existing data to evaluate whether we felt there were undesirable results for water quality already happening in the basin. And the conclusion we came to is that the answer is no, and that current water quality supports beneficial uses, both agriculture, primarily agricultural, and municipal and industrial. We acknowledge that there are some water quality challenges for the municipal use, but that those are managed by the city through blending with its different water sources. So but we concluded that that's not an undesirable result because it's something that's being managed effectively by the city. So the next thing we looked at is whether there's a relationship between potential undesirable results for water quality and groundwater conditions. You may recall that part of the definition of undesirable results requires a nexus between pumping or implementation of the GSP on the sustainability indicator. And what we concluded is that under current conditions, there's not really a strong relationship between changes in water quality and pumping But we recognize that if pumping increased, particularly in the Magoo, the shallower of the two principal aquifers, there is some potential that pumping could increase the rate of downward movement of poor quality water that we know exists in the geologic units above the Magoo aquifer. And in fact, in some areas, we think there's an indication that that may have happened locally in some areas. So that's the nexus between pumping and potential undesirable results. So because there is a nexus, we're required under Sigma to develop SMCs for the indicator. We can't screen it out, in other words, like we did the interconnected surface water. So the next question that we're required to evaluate is, what are the potential effects on beneficial users? And of course, degradation of water quality could increase costs for treatment. It could affect crop yields. It could cause increased water demand, particularly for agriculture, for leaching, et cetera. So those are the effects that we would be evaluating in terms of potential undesirable results. So Sigma requires that we develop and evaluate criteria for establishing minimum thresholds. And some of the requirements are specifically laid out in Sigma. We have to consider existing water quality regulations, so things like maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. And the Regional Water Quality Control Board, RWQCB, has a basin plan for the Mound and other basins, and they establish water quality objectives, WQOs, in that plan that apply to the protection of beneficial uses in the basin. And so we're required by law to consider those and use them unless we have a good reason not to. That's essentially what the regulations say. Other things are left to the basin based on basin-specific beneficial uses to evaluate. So in our basin, agriculture is an important water user. So we looked at and considered toxicity thresholds for certain constituents in the water for agriculture use. And then, of course, we also considered what the existing water quality is when we develop the recommended minimum thresholds. So the idea behind the minimum thresholds is to define a measurable thing. In this case, we're going to talk about concentrations of different constituents in the groundwater that, if exceeded, would be considered significant and unreasonable. And we do that and try and do that in a manner that's consistent with our sustainability goal. So after evaluating all of the criteria listed above and comparing those different thresholds and WQOs and MCLs to our current water quality, staff concluded that the Regional Water Quality Control Board water quality objectives best capture the level beyond where we might start having significant and unreasonable effects. There's one exception for one constituent where the existing water quality, in the case of total dissolved solids or TDS in the Wainimi aquifer, already exists, exceeds the WQO. And so we propose an alternative value that's higher than the WQO to reflect the fact that the WQO is not representative of existing conditions. So those thresholds, again, apply at locations that we measure water quality in the basin that represent different areas of the basin and would define whether there's the likelihood of significant unreasonable effects at those locations or the areas that those monitoring locations represent. The next step is to define the criteria for what we would consider being undesirable results. And that means what combination of minimum threshold exceedances at those various locations throughout the basin would we consider being representative of an undesirable result condition for the basin. And so really we're looking at what combination, what number of exceedances would that look like where we would say that's undesirable. And so the proposal is, because we have a very limited number of monitoring locations in the basin, in the aquifers, is that we would not conclude there's undesirable results unless all of the representative wells in a particular principal aquifer are exceeding the minimum threshold concentration. And in addition to that, we would want to see that for continuously for 2 years of measurements so that we know for sure that this is a trend that truly is exceeding and is going to be an ongoing situation that needs to be addressed. So 2 years in all the wells is what the criteria would be for concluding undesirable results. And so what this looks like spatially is in the Magoo Aquifer, we have 3 locations that are regularly monitored. 2 of them in green have representative data. The third one, colored in yellow, has abnormal data, outliers, a lot of outliers. And so we don't consider that data from that well to be representative of the background conditions in the aquifer. And so we will not consider that third well. So for the Magoo Aquifer, we would be looking at these 2 monitoring wells, one at the coast and one inland, exceeding those thresholds for the constituents continuously for 2 years before we would conclude that we have undesirable results. And on a side note, but an important side note, it's important to understand that having undesirable results is the condition that would trigger us being in default of our plan and would trigger potential intervention by the State Water Resources Control Board to come in and take some actions to get the basin in compliance with its plan. So one of the things we want to do when we're setting these is also keep that in mind and making sure that our thresholds are not only protective of the uses, but attainable. I should have mentioned that earlier, I apologize. Moving on to the other principal aquifer, the Wainimi. This is the aquifer that has most of the pumping. So no surprise, we have more monitoring locations in this aquifer. We have 6 regularly monitored locations. We have a couple that have anomalous data that we would not consider in evaluating the minimum thresholds and undesirable results. So it would be the 4 green locations, which thankfully cover the majority of the basin and they're spaced out. Keeping in mind that the northern half of the basin has no pumping. So we're really focused in the middle part of the basin where the city has its wells in here and the agricultural production is predominantly over here. So in terms of where the production's happening, we have good coverage. So the other component of the management criteria is our measurable objective. Again, this is more of our goal and what we would like to see. So the proposal is to have a goal that looks or seeks to preserve the existing water quality in the basin. So we don't want to see it degrade if at all possible. So our MOs are based on recent historical groundwater quality and set at levels that we believe are attainable based on historical trends so that we would meet these goals in our plan. So this example chart shows the data for one constituent, sulfate in this case, for the Wainimi aquifer. And let me break this down for you. The dashed red line is the measurable objective, that's the goal. So because this is water quality and lower concentrations are better, when we talk about meeting our goals or not exceeding our threshold, we want lower numbers. We want lowers below the lines. So the goal is the dashed line, the MO. The minimum threshold or MT is the solid line. So we definitely want to have at most, if not all of our data plotting below that line because that's the indication of where significant unreasonable effects might be occurring. And what you can see is that we have 2 wells that regularly plot above that line. That's the green circles, which that particular well has a lot of data. And the brownish X with a line through it is the other one that has a few data points, but consistently plots way above all of the other data. And in these wells, we believe there is either something going on with the stratigraphy that causes the screen zones of these wells to communicate with shallower zones, or perhaps there is something going on with the seal of the well that allows the well to communicate with shallower zones. We don't really know exactly why, but what we do know is that it's clearly anomalous. And in fact, if you look at other constituents, these wells stick out even more like a sore thumb compared to the other wells in the basin. So that's why we're not including them as representative locations in the basin for the purposes of evaluating sustainability. So I want to focus on the rest of the data, the purple triangles, the green squares, the blue diamonds, and the black plus signs. And again, applying our criteria, what we want to have is, we do not want to have all of our wells plotting above the red solid line continuously for 2 years. That would be the condition which we define in our plan as constituting undesirable results. And what you can see is actually most of our data is clustered around the dash line, which is our measurable objective, indicating that our average conditions in the basin are meeting our measurable objective or our goal, which is what we want to see. So that's how that would work. And this would be the same type of analysis for the nitrate, the total dissolved solids, chloride, boron are our indicator constituents. I just picked one for demonstration purposes. So this table basically pulls all of the information together that I just described, mostly conceptually, and proposes all the quantitative minimum thresholds and measurable objectives, and compares that against average groundwater quality over the last 10 years in those representative wells, in addition to the regional board's objectives and the MCLs. We don't have time tonight to go through the details. This information is available from a prior board presentation for those who want to dig into it. If you can't find it, just email Jackie or I will point you to it. But the point of tonight was to lay out the rationale for the numbers and get feedback on that if we can a little bit later. So now I want to move on to the remaining sustainability indicators and talk about the reduction of groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and lowering of groundwater levels. We're going to focus on seawater intrusion and land subsidence because if there's concurrence on the approach for those two, the other two are kind of automatically addressed. And I'll explain why that is later. So the analysis for these relied on model output. John talked a lot about the water budget, and the water budget is an important part of the basin setting plan. It's background information, understanding basically what the plumbing of the basin is and how the basin works. But ultimately for management, we can't go out and measure a water budget component, so we can't manage based on it. We end up managing based primarily for these indicators on groundwater levels. So I'm going to present some of the groundwater level results from the model. So some conclusions before I show the charts from those future simulations, and you may already kind of be able to deduce some of this from the water budget. Future groundwater levels are predicted to be higher than historical levels. And this is primarily due to anticipated increases in groundwater levels in the adjacent Oxnard Basin. John talked about how the groundwater flow is going to reverse. Historically, waters left our basin and entered the Oxnard Plain Basin. In the future, that pattern is going to reverse and the basins will equilibrate to a new higher level because the Fox Canyon GMA is going to be taking actions to address the very large overdraft in that basin. So as that basin rises, ours will rise as well and they'll equilibrate. That's what's basically predicted to happen in the future. The other conclusion that John talked about is that the impact of climate change is relatively small, perhaps within the error of the model. So we don't really need to really consider that much further in our planning. And the other conclusion was that you'll see in the water level data is the Freeman expansion project that I mentioned is almost undetectable in its effect on the Mound Basin. So we don't really need to be too concerned about whether that project moves forward or doesn't for the Mound Basin. It's much more important for the Oxnard Basin. So I'm going to show some groundwater level output from 2 locations, one at the coast, remember that's going to be this blue color, and one inland in the orange color. So this first chart is at the coast, and this is a monitoring well at Marina Park. And this particular zone of the monitoring well is in the Magoo Aquifer. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is historical data, dots representing measured groundwater levels, the blue line representing the calibrated groundwater model. And then where you see 2021 over to the right, going to 2100, 2100 is all projected. That's all from the model based on all those assumptions we talked about. And we've plotted the results from the 4 different scenarios that I described in the first presentation. And the takeaway here is that the lines pretty much plot on top of each other. There's not a lot of difference between the scenarios we ran in terms of the effect of climate change and the effect of the Freeman expansion, plus or minus maybe 5 feet at most, happening only in a few places. So what this tells us, and we also understand from the water budget, is that, again, that climate change is not going to be a major factor in our planning, as is the Freeman expansion project. So again, the takeaways I showed, what you can see is on average, the groundwater levels are going to be projected to be higher than historical. What's going on here in the beginning is just an artifact of our period that we took. The period we start with from in 1943 starts wet and then has a drought. So that's why there's this rapid rise and then fall. But I encourage people not to get too focused on the particular pattern here. What we're really focused on is the latter part of this period, which after the Fox Canyon has implemented its GSP, as you can see, groundwater levels are kind of steadily rising. This is the period we're focused on where we'll be trying to maintain sustainable conditions. And so what I'm looking for here is when we get out into the later period, what happens in a drought? And you can see this very last drought happening in the 2090s. This is the same hydrologic conditions that we just went through in the latter part of the last decade. And what you can see is in the future, the drought is projected to have a much lesser impact on groundwater levels. And that's, again, primarily because the Oxnard Basin, which we're connected to, will be being operated much differently than it was historically. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through the details of the other graphs. They all pretty much have the same story. The pattern's a little bit different for the Hueneme Aquifer than the Magoo because there's more pumping in the Hueneme, but the conclusions are the same. So now I want to talk about what this means for seawater intrusion. As John mentioned, seawater intrusion is not like the same concern that we have in the Oxnard Basin. And that's because in the Mound Basin, the aquifers are not exposed to seawater near the shoreline, or at least we don't think they are. We know they're exposed to seawater offshore about 10.5 miles, where the aquifers actually daylight on the edge of the shelf and touch the seawater. Between that location and the shoreline, we believe the aquifers are protected from seawater by that same thick sequence of fine grade deposits I described in the first presentation. And so one of the things we want to understand is how far has seawater moved shoreward from that offshore opening, if you will, during the historical period that we've had pumping over the last roughly century. So we ran the model in a way that allowed us to estimate the movement of seawater from that offshore location in the aquifer towards the shoreline. And what we found is that the seawater is not moving towards the shore in the Magoo. There's actually fresh water moving offshore. But in the Hueneme aquifer, we found that there may have been, on average, roughly half a mile of migration over the last century. And so that's what this map is showing. It's showing a zoomed in look at the where the aquifers are exposed on the seafloor offshore, about 10 miles, and we're showing about a half mile here in the blue stipple pattern of average landward migration. And when I say average, what I mean is that the aquifer is not uniform. So the seawater is going to move, or water in general is going to move through the aquifer at different rates depending on the nature of the materials at any particular depth. So the average rate would be if it was all moving at the same rate, but we know that doesn't happen because some zones are more permeable than others. So I've got this little disclaimer here, and you'll see it on other slides, that the migration rate in the most permeable zones could be several times higher. So perhaps in the most permeable zone, maybe it's moved, let's say, a mile or a mile and a half or something like that. We don't really know, but we need to consider that in our planning. So our conclusions is that seawater hasn't moved towards land in the Mugu aquifer. It has in the Hueneme, but the time frame for that seawater to migrate from its current location of, say, 9 miles or so offshore is much longer than the Sigma planning horizon. So we're off the hook, maybe. And when I say maybe, what I'm saying is that we have to consider for the potential that there could be a short circuit pathway for seawater somewhere near the shoreline. We don't know if that fine grain unit is an effective barrier to seawater everywhere. There could be an area where it's eroded or it's coarser, and there could be some communication with the aquifers and the seawater, or faults. And there's a number of faults that cross through the basin and extend offshore that could act as a conduit for water to move vertically down into the aquifers. We don't know. We don't have any way of knowing whether those conditions exist. So what staff is proposing is that we plan as if that could happen and monitor as if that could happen as a contingency in our plan. So this map is just trying to indicate, what would happen if there was somehow a pathway for seawater into the aquifers near the shoreline. So to evaluate this risk, we did some more flow line tracking with the particles. And the question we were trying to answer is, if hypothetically we had seawater in our aquifer at the shoreline when we begin implementation of our GSP, how far might it go inland during the 20-year implementation period and the 50-year total planning horizon for Sigma? And the answer is that the average rate would be about, I don't know, 1/8 of a mile or so in the first 20 years, and maybe a 1/4 mile or so over the full 50 years. Again, understanding that in the most permeable zones, it could travel a little bit faster. So this is good news because we do not have any beneficial uses of groundwater in the areas that we project that seawater could move. In fact, we don't have any until we get to these blue dots in the map, which are the current wells, agricultural wells in the Olivas corridor. So we have plenty of time to react to seawater if we see it coming on shore. If we have a short circuit, we can deal with this and deal with it effectively with a contingency plan in our GSP. So I've already kind of covered these results, a little short on time, so I'm going to try and move this quickly here. So again, we don't think seawater's intrusion is anticipated in our 50-year Sigma planning horizon, but we should have a monitoring and contingency plan to address it. So what would that look like? Well, it would include establishing SMCs for seawater intrusion, and staff is proposing that we consider the undesirable result to be having seawater intrusion that extends east of Harbor Boulevard. And the reason east of Harbor Boulevard is selected is because there are no current or anticipated future beneficial uses of groundwater west of Harbor Boulevard. And so you could think of that as sort of a sacrificial zone that gives us a buffer in between the coast and east of Harbor Boulevard, where we start to have agricultural land use and existing beneficial uses and potential future beneficial uses with wells potentially closer to Harbor Boulevard in the future. For the minimum threshold, we would propose that that would be seawater observed in monitoring wells located at or near Harbor Boulevard. That's sort of the line we're trying to defend, if you can picture that in your mind. And the measurable objective would be no seawater in those same wells. So this map is just kind of showing this coastal area that would be our buffer zone with our agricultural beneficial uses here east of Boulevard that we're trying to protect. And so we would need to increase our monitoring network in order to implement this. Right now, we have one well at the coast. The northern blue dot is our Marina Park monitoring well. And we're going to soon have another well funded by the Department of Water Resources here, the southern red dot. So in order to implement this monitoring and contingency program, we would need another well, at least one other well along the coast, along the shoreline to detect seawater coming on shore. And then we would need a second well along Harbor Boulevard to implement our minimum thresholds and measurable objective monitoring for our SMCs. All right, so that's seawater intrusion and how we would propose to monitor and have a contingency plan for seawater intrusion. I want to talk about subsidence, one of the other indicators. And the short answer is that subsidence is not anticipated in the future because our projections are is that groundwater levels will be above historical low levels going forward during plan implementation. And the reason that's important is because inelastic subsidence does not really happen or cannot physically happen unless you lower groundwater levels below their historical low. And I don't have time to explain the physics of that, but we can follow up with you afterwards if you are curious about the physics of why that's true. So for inelastic subsidence, we're not anticipating that in the planning horizon, but because there's the potential that groundwater levels could go below lows if the basin is operated one way or another in the future, we are required to establish the sustainable management criteria and have them in the plan. So the proposal for conceptualizing the undesirable results would be that this area west of Harbor Boulevard that I talked about that would be sacrificial for seawater also has some unique characteristics that make it susceptible to land subsidence. One of those characteristics is that the city has its main sewer line running to the wastewater treatment plant right along Harbor Boulevard. And that particular line has a very low slope. And so that's critical infrastructure that would be susceptible to significant and potentially unreasonable impacts if there were enough land subsidence in that area. The other issue is that that coastal area is going to be affected by sea level rise, and there'll be effects with storm surge and other sea level rise related impacts. So arguably, if we were to have inelastic subsidence in that area, we would at a minimum exacerbate those impacts and arguably significantly and unreasonably increase those impacts that are already going to be a challenge for the primarily the Pierpont community and the harbor area. So that's the rationale for identifying that area as for consideration and management. And so we would propose that the minimum threshold be to not allow groundwater levels to go below historical lows in that area as a proxy for preventing potential subsidence in that area that's susceptible. Now, theoretically, you could have groundwater levels below historical lows in other parts of the basin, but the hydrology or the hydraulics of the basin is such that you could not sustain historical or levels below historical lows in other areas for very long without also causing the levels to go below historical lows at Harbor Boulevard. So to simplify this process, we're proposing that the threshold be to not go below historical lows anywhere in the basin. The measurable objective or the goal would simply then just to be try and make sure we have groundwater levels high enough during wet periods to prevent them from dropping below the historical lows during droughts. So that's the construct that's proposed for subsidence. And I'll show an example of what those levels look like on one of the charts that we had. So the minimum threshold in this example was selected based on the historical low measured level. And the measurable objective was selected based on the historical high. And the idea here is that under historical conditions, that was the level that was necessary going into a drought to make sure we didn't get below the historical low. Going forward, we think the basin will respond less severely to droughts and recover more rapidly. And we believe groundwater levels will be higher. So meeting this measurable objective shouldn't be an issue going forward. I'm going to skip the other examples of this in the interest of time and just briefly talk about the two remaining sustainability indicators. Groundwater level declines or chronic groundwater level declines and groundwater storage. Those two really work together. The storage is highly correlated with the groundwater levels. And so you can think of those as kind of working together. If there's concurrence on the proposed approach, particularly for this subsidence, these indicators will not really have a controlling impact on management because we would be managing to not go below historical lows for subsidence. The effects that you would have for groundwater level declines or groundwater storage declines would happen at much lower levels than the proposed framework for subsidence. So we don't really need to talk about these any further because the other indicators will be the controlling indicators on the basin management. One other takeaway is that because of the importance and the magnitude of the effect on the connection with the Oxnard Plain, that our plan will need to emphasize that tracking and collaborating with Fox Canyon GMA on their progress towards achieving their sustainability goal will be key to us achieving our goals in our plan. And I think the water budget and groundwater level data I showed made that clear. So next steps for our planning process, we're hoping to get feedback from stakeholders on the proposed SMCs here in March. Hopefully we get some tonight in the session after this presentation. And then we'll be working towards finalizing those SMCs and incorporating them into a draft GSP later in June or July and issuing that for comments, and then wrapping up and finalizing that GSP for adoption towards the end of the year. We can have another workshop if there's a lot of interest on the SMCs. We could put out another workshop in the April or May timeframe if that's necessary. Otherwise, we would probably be looking at having a workshop around the time we issue the draft GSP. So that in a thumbnail sketch is the rest of the year and the rest of how we lay out what we're going to be doing for developing the GSP. I do want to note, just as a reminder, that the process doesn't end with the GSP in 2022. We have 20 years that we're required to implement and be sustainable. I argue that we're already sustainable based on our projections, but we have 20 years in which we technically have to be sustainable. And what's going to happen in that 20 years is we're required to update and readopt our GSP every 5 years. So the message there is that we want to have a reasonable plan to start with, and we can adapt the plan as we learn from our data and adapt that at least once every 5 years going forward. So with that, I have talked plenty enough. So why don't we go ahead and just roll into our Q&A session since we're a little bit behind, and we can take questions on any of the topics presented tonight. So with that, I would ask for Jackie, maybe you can update me where we are, or John, on the Q&As.
Yeah, we do have a question from Greg Smith. John had proposed to answer it, but he said to field it to you. He'd like to know, what was the assumption of city population increase or decrease to 2070?
So we did not have to actually make estimates of what the population is going to be, because we concluded that regardless of population change, there won't be an impact on the water demand as it affects the Mound Basin planning, because the city has a net zero policy for water.
Okay, let me see if there's any others. We do have one from Bert Handy. He'd like to know, when the force main was replaced along Harbor Boulevard, was the main found to be compromised, releasing contaminants into the perched aquifer? And has this water quality improved since the force main was replaced?
I guess I don't have knowledge of that, but and maybe Director Runger can answer, but I would just say that that's not really a sustainability issue, because the perched aquifer is not a principal aquifer that we're going to be managing that in this plan. I don't mean to trivialize any potential effects that may be related to this condition that Mr. Handy's talking about, but it's kind of out of bounds for the GSA in terms of its planning and what it's required to manage.
I can just quickly say, we can check with the Public Works Department responsible for the project, but I know they did have to do water quality testing before, during, and after. So they might have some information, working with the county also.
Okay, were there any other open questions, or do we need to go back to any of the, I see quite a few questions answered. Was there anything that we just skim through these real quick? Flow model map. Some questions about water purchases from Casitas. Looks like these are all answered.
They are.
Okay.
Staff has been really great on getting back to our public.
But if folks still want to talk about these, they can do it
Oh,
verbally
yes.
too. Just raise your hand and
Sure.
Jackie will
Yeah.
put you into the
Oh
conversation.
yeah, don't be shy.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to get feedback on the SMCs. So even if if all you want to say is it, sounds logical, thank you. We'd love that feedback. If you've got questions or concerns and let us know that you have that, and we can either set up for you to reach out to staff, or the next board meeting on the Jackie 18th, I believe. Some of these topics are going to come back to the board. That's another opportunity. You could send in written comments. We have a comment form on our website that can be used to submit comments. So one way or another, we want to get your feedback on these important planning topics.
Yeah, just to confirm, Brian, that is March 18th. I'm sorry. Yeah, March 18th.
Great. So I guess while we're waiting for people to think of questions or comments, maybe I can show them the comment form on the website. Jackie, help me out. Where did we tuck that away?
So if you go to the GSP.
Okay, yes, public comments invited. All right, here we go.
Mhm.
I don't use the form, so I don't. So here it is, and you can put your name and email address in, so we can contact you to discuss your comments or questions if necessary. There's a pull down menu where you can identify which chapter of the GSP. Don't worry too much about that if you're not sure. Just pick what sounds like the most relevant section to the thing you want to talk about in your comment or question. We'll fix that if it's not right. Don't worry about it. And then you can go ahead and type in your comment question here. And then we also ask you if you want to be added to our interested parties list, which if you're not already, you just click yes, and then you'll start getting emails about all our meetings and other updates, our newsletter. And then if you're so inclined, you can indicate what sort of beneficial use you represent, and then go through the process here to prove that you're not a robot and submit. So really straightforward. If you feel more comfortable using that, if that resource is there available to you. So it looks like we have a couple questions came in. Looks like, okay, here's Mr. Handy's question that we answered. And then Greg Smith, excellent presentation, issues seem well considered. Thank you, Greg. Thank you for that. Okay, all right. Give folks another minute. Another question from Laura. SMCs sound reasonable and protective of beneficial uses. Nice job presenting the details. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you for promoting our webinar on the Watershed Committee's website email blast. Thank you. Okay. Well, looks like we're getting at diminishing returns here. Maybe give it another minute or two for folks. I don't know. I see Dan Detmer's on. I don't know if Dan, if you have anything you want to add, go ahead and speak up. Bobby Sheck's here. Oh, there's.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. I see your hand there.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Minor clarification. I just wanted to confirm we're not waiting for seawater chemistry to show up at Harbor Boulevard. It's any indication of seawater intrusion at that vicinity. So you were speaking about seawater. I know that wasn't your intent, but it was just like any indication is what it. Yeah.
Right. And if we're at a point where we're looking closely for seawater at Harbor Boulevard, we will have already detected it at our shoreline wells and know that it's on its way. And we'd have a pretty good idea of how long it would take to get there. So yeah.
Yeah, unlikely scenario. I just wanted to clarify that for folks if they needed it.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Good job tonight.
Okay. Let's see. Laura wanted to know how many people attended. What do we have in our? Well, right now we have 9 attendees. I think we had more earlier.
Yeah, we had 10, 11, where we are, 10 attendees. I think just one dropped off, but.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Laura, we're gonna be working with you to help promote this more. We'd like to get more engagement. I know that the agricultural group is organized and Director Chambers represents them. And I think, we feel good that the word gets out, but it'd be nice to have more participation if we can make that happen. So I think we're at diminishing returns here. We did reserve, some time for directors to make comments. So I guess we can transition into that stage. If there are director comments that would like to be made, go ahead.
Hey, Brian, isn't there another attendee poll question due now?
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Why don't we roll those? Yeah, thank you, Chair Mobley. There they are. There's 3 more questions. Give those a few minutes. We're doing. Like, give another minute there, Zach. How are we doing, Zach? It's like,
I'm gonna give it end it right here at 2 minutes on the dot. I think you're pretty much got everybody's participation.
all right, great, thank you. All right, so the first question was trying to understand how people felt about the proposed sustainable management criteria. And had some folks that agree with it, one that would like to think about it and may comment at the next board meeting, one that doesn't know and needs more information, and a couple that do not have an opinion. And the second question was trying to understand which indicator you're most concerned about, and that's only if you answer that you have a concern or don't know. And so seawater intrusion was the one answer there. And then third question, we're trying to understand how folks would want to engage with the GSA if they're not sure or have a concern. And that person answered that they would wait and just may provide comments on the GSP. So that's helpful. Thank you for answering those questions. And I think we can roll into the director comment session.
So Director Rundgren here. Just want to make some comments. Really appreciate all the work you put into it, Brian, and consultants and United for all your modeling work. I think it's a really well done report. We have a ways to go still, but everyone's working really well together and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Other directors, go ahead.
Chair, this is Glenn. I want to second Susan's comments. Very well prepared and executed workshop today for the public. And we're on a very good and I believe confident path towards getting to our GSP by the end of the calendar year. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I'll agree with the two directors. Great job. Everyone seems to be really pulling together now. We've got some great momentum. Seemed like we had a kind of a slow start, but we really are gaining ground quickly now. And I think we'll charge to the finish line, but very well put together workshop this time. It shows that you guys put a lot of work into it, very professional. I can't imagine it being better. And yeah, I wasn't sure we were able to fill the full 2 hours, but we probably could have used 3 hours if there was that much more information that we could have presented. But great job, everybody, especially Brian. Super. So other directors? And thank you to the United staff, especially Jackie. I know you put a lot of time in this too, so.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
I'd also like to recognize Intera Incorporated. I know that Intera did not participate in the presentations, but rest assured they are behind the scenes, a very important part of this team, filling the gaps between what United's doing and what I'm doing. And we would not be in the position that we're in without Intera's support. So thank you, Abhishek, who's still online here from Intera. And of course, it goes without saying, United staff is really stepped up to the plate and got a lot of work done in a short amount of time in the last three or so months, and we're very appreciative of that. Well, if that's that for comments, then Chair Mobley, I would suggest that we could possibly adjourn at this point.
I think that is appropriate. So thank you again to everyone that attended, and certainly if you have more comments, please email Brian or watch our next board meeting online Zoom and make your comments. But keep following us as we make progress, and tell your coworkers and any other people that that might be interested, let them follow or let them know what's going on so they can participate. We don't want to leave anybody behind. This is very important. This is our future. So let's support staff as we get this GSA done. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you. And I will call the meeting to an end. We're at 8:04. Great job, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. All right. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Brian. Great job.
Thanks for having all that ready. Thanks, Zach.
Yep. I'll see you guys next time. Great job, everyone.
Yeah. Woohoo. All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care.